difficult, on the facades of the Oslo Opera House. By transforming this iconic, beautiful building into a canvas, with data-driven audiovisual storytelling, we will bring international attention to the Arctic. Arctic as the global thermostat and epicenter of our global climate system. So here's a brief video introducing you to the creative concept behind it, serving as inspiration for tackling communication issues through the international language of art. So if you can please take down the light a bit.
In 200 years, people will look back on this particular period and say to themselves, how did those people at that time just allow all these amazing creatures to vanish? But it would be very little use in me or anybody else exerting all this energy to save the wild places if people are not being educated into being better stewards than we've been. If we all lose hope, there is no hope. Without hope, people fall into apathy. There's still a lot left that's worth fighting for.
So we hope this video gets your thoughts flowing as to how creativity can help communicate environmental messaging to motivate and mobilize people to action. So now we would like to have our participants in Stockholm talk together and Madrid and check in with each other. So if you can sit together 2 and 2. in groups and just spend a few minutes talking about the emotion this video evoked in you and tell each other what inspired you to join here today. Just a little check-in on the questions. Okay, thank you. You will have more time to talk later, so it's great that you have a lot to talk about. But we are so lucky to be joined by 3 panelists for our session today, and it's with pleasure I introduce them to you. All 3 have different perspectives to the team today due to their background, lives, work, education, culture, age, gender, so forth. So, Amanda Mie Andersson is a master's student studying change management in Norway, in a small place. Amanda holds a bachelor in techno-anthropology from Copenhagen, with a specialization in user and citizen involvement in environmental and sustainable transition process. Amanda is also from Denmark, where she was part of the Young Green movement. Yeah. And then in the middle, we have Katarina Inga. She's a research associate at the Stockholm Environment Institute, also short for SEI, holding degrees in both biology and environmental law. Internationally, Katarina has represented Sami indigenous perspectives within the Arctic Council Working Group for Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna. And thank you for wearing your beautiful dress today. Marcus Carson is a senior research fellow at Stockholm Environment Institute and associate professor of sociology. Marcus led phase 2 of the Arctic Resilience Assessment and was co-lead author for the Resilience chapter in Adaptation Actions in a Changing Arctic for AMAP, short for Arctic Monitoring Assessment Program. Yeah. And Marcus is from the US, although you've been living in Sweden for like 20 years or something more.
Something like that.
Yeah. So thank you all for joining us today. And I would like to turn it over to you to share your thoughts regarding global climate impacts on the Arctic and some key points from your perspective and area of expertise. So Amanda, we'll start with you.
Yes. Well, I think to start with, I think this video is a very good way of pointing out some of the really important issues on climate change and the Arctic. The Arctic is a really important issue at the moment that we don't talk enough about. It is the refrigerator of the Earth. It's the only place that loses more heat than it gains. And that is because of the Arctic atmosphere, where we lose some heat. And that is really important for the whole climate system, also due to currents and to weather systems. So it's really important for the balance of the temperature on the Earth in general. And we know that the northern hemisphere is warming up a lot faster than the southern hemisphere. And right now, the Arctic is the place on Earth that's warming up the fastest. And it's been like that for the last 30 years. And due to that, we've seen a huge loss of ice. And right now, we're losing around 270 gigatons per year. That's been like that since between 2006 till 2015. So that's a lot, and that's really critical for the climate system in general, because the loss of ice is crucial for the whole planet as well. We see sea level rise when we lose ice on land. When we lose sea ice, we lose the effect of albedo. So that's when the sun radiation hits back on Earth, and Earth actually reflects out from the light surfaces. And when we don't have these light surfaces anymore, then the Earth is exposed, the darker places on Earth are exposed to the sun, and we keep the heat on Earth instead. And that makes some really big issues for the albedo effect and some really big feedback loops, so it makes it even warmer on Earth. Yeah, I think that's some of the really important things, as well as biodiversity as well.
Of course.
Yeah.
And biodiversity, that is maybe a key word for you, Katarina.
Yeah, biodiversity is very important, and it's also that 80% of the global biodiversity is in areas where indigenous people are managing. So, and the Arctic is not only ice, it's also people's home. And you have several indigenous groups living in the Arctic, and they have lived there together with the nature in a sustainable way for very long. And when the climate is changing, you also change the way of living, so you have to adapt to it. And if you can still have the biodiversity, you will also, if you manage the land as the indigenous people, you will automatically also keep the biodiversity. So I think it's really important to listen to and learn from the indigenous people how you should do so that you can keep the biodiversity.
Thank you. And Marcus, I guess you have many other different perspectives you can share. You mentioned wetlands in a question earlier today, but also if you take us on the bigger climate system.
Yeah, I guess I could go back to what we found in the resilience report, and that of course ties to climate. One of the ironies is that the change being driven in the Arctic is mostly being driven from outside of the Arctic. But there are paybacks, and the changes that are taking place there feed back to the rest of the planet. So as you already mentioned, it is the cooling system for the planet. People talk about the Amazon being the lungs of the world. The poles are the cooling system of the world. And as those change, it has all sorts of disturbing effects on the climate system. So you see droughts, you see these enormous cold spells in North America, where temperatures drop far below what they have historically been because the temperature differentials are changing. And I guess the most worrisome thing are the feedback effects, because as you lose this reflectivity, the albedo, and the sun's radiation is absorbed to a much greater extent, you get this acceleration that's very much like leaving a microphone turn on a little bit too high, and pretty soon your eardrums are breaking. We're seeing similar kinds of effects with almost each year we see a new sea ice minimum. We see enormous loss of ice from the Greenlandic ice sheet. And that's not only, it's not raising sea levels around Greenland because the weight of that ice is disappearing, but it is pushing water into the seas that shows up on the other side of the planet where that gravity doesn't pull it. What I worry about the most, and what we found in the resilience report, is that it's not just the albedo feedback that's of concern. There are a whole range of other both climate system and ecosystem feedback loops. And when you put those all in the same pot and stir them together, we don't know what the knock-on effect of one tipping point created, sort of triggering another. But we certainly see that people who live in the Arctic are wrestling with the impacts of rapid change, disturbing not only their livelihoods, but also the sort of infrastructure that we take for granted. Roads in Alaska, whole buildings in the Russian Federation, things that are collapsing because what used to be very solid underneath them is disappearing. And then we have other side effects like methane release. Even I spoke with a biologist a week ago talking about some of the old diseases that have been frozen into the permafrost, anthrax and things like that are still there and still potentially active, that as the permafrost thaws can be released. So there's quite a range of changes afoot. These are changes that are not straight line. They tend to have thresholds where things take off out of control or in unexpected directions. And when you stir those all together into one space, it's very, very difficult to predict what comes out of that, and that could be really worrisome.
When you talk about this permafrost, I get this Jurassic Park feeling.
Well, yeah, except in this case, it's very small microorganisms rather than dinosaurs or mastodons.
But it's true, isn't it? It was two boys in Russia a couple of years ago, and the reindeers that actually had the disease. Isn't it so?
I don't recall the details, but I think there have been a couple of instances of anthrax breaking out, exposures that have happened. Yeah.
This year it was a lot of fires, and still is in the Amazons, but it's also been fires in the Arctic, in Siberia.
Yeah.
That was not that much in the news, but
yes,
very important and dramatic.
Yeah,
Can
and
you
in
explain
Sweden
why?
2 years ago.
And
for
in
example,
Sweden 2 years ago,
enormous
absolutely.
fires. You mentioned the wetlands question, and Katarina and I have worked together on this. But if you think about how carbon is stored on the planet, there is a shocking amount of carbon stored in peat that sits under this water layer that doesn't decompose because the water prevents oxygen from supporting this decomposition. And there are lots of wetland areas that we've heard recent political campaigns where people talk about drain the swamp. There's still an idea that these areas aren't very useful. And most of what you read about wetlands still starts off with some kind of a statement that says, people used to think of wetlands as wastelands, but now we know better. The problem is not everybody knows better yet. And there are a lot of areas that have been drained with the idea that they're more useful dry, or areas in the Russian tundra or in Alaska and Canada that have been damaged due to oil and gas exploration. And when those areas are dry, they are much more likely to leak carbon. So that, for example, 20% of Sweden's carbon emissions come from drained wetlands areas. Over half of Iceland's carbon emissions come from wetlands, which is one of the reasons that Iceland is taking this huge initiative to restore these wetlands areas. And in many instances, it's quite low tech. It's just backfilling these areas that have been, the ditches that are draining them away. But with that water layer, you not only prevent the peat from decomposing, but you also put an insulation layer over the permafrost and can prevent that. And that buys us time. That doesn't mean that we don't need to tackle the energy issues that are so crucial, but it buys us time for climate change, and it also helps protect the biodiversity and the livelihoods of people who depend on these regions for mixed economies, for maintaining a way of life.
Thank you for sharing your important perspectives. It's clear that what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. So, next question. Okay. So, how can we increase the value of the Arctic and drive solutions to protect it? I'm asking you to the audience again. If you can sit together, maybe 4 and 4, if you just turn and discuss these questions. How can we increase the value of the Arctic and drive solutions to protect it? Okay, we're moving again. So we are faced with mountain challenges when trying to bring the Arctic to the forefront of the global dialogue on climate change. We heard earlier today that Gudbrandsson, the Icelandic environmental minister, said that he was happy Chile had managed to put the oceans on the agenda. But how about the Arctic? I guess everybody know about the ice bears and the ice has been talking about, but bringing Arctic to the forefront. Why is this? Why is this so difficult? Why is it because it's so far away, or why? What do you think, Marcus? What role does the Arctic play?
Yeah, well, I think it's distant. It's been distant in people's experience, and it's been, we've seen it as a sort of a frozen, I don't want to call it a wasteland, but this frozen space that sits still where people are, at least when I grew up, there were weapons being aimed across that great expanse of ice and snow, and people hoped that nothing would happen there. I do think that's changing, though. When we released the Arctic Resilience Report, in collaboration with our colleagues at Resilience Center, the report was downloaded over 10,000 times. There was a lot of attention, and some of that's because of the weather patterns coming out of the Arctic. Some of it's the conflict. Some of that's the understanding of the indigenous communities that are struggling with change. And maybe part of it's just the warning signals that we're starting to tune into that and feeling them closer to home, which I think has been one of the real challenges with a problem like climate change that seems so far away in space and time, and certainly the causes are separated from the impacts in space and time.
Katarina, what do you think?
Yes, I think also because when you say Arctic, you think of ice, right? And that's also something that is kind of conserved, so it's just like static, right? It's just there, it's ice, but it's not. As I said before, it's living, and also it's a part of our lands as well, and it has really important ecosystems. And for example, the reindeer is a key species for these ecosystems, and it lives circumpolar, so it's live in all the Arctic, and it's very important to our ecosystems to work. I don't know, for me it's obvious that it's important, but I guess it's hard to understand it if you haven't seen it, or if you don't want to understand the value of it. So I think it's time for us to want to understand and listen to others as well.
Amanda, how can we engage the public and influence the practices of human actions, do you think, to protect the Arctic?
Well, I think, first of all, as we talked of a bit earlier, it's very important to understand that the problem of the Arctic is a global problem. The situation in the Arctic is just a symptom of a sick Earth. And therefore, we also need to act globally in some cases. So I really personally believe that it's really important that we get our politicians to be more ambitious in the politics, in the climate politics in general. And I also, at the same time, believe that because, as you said, Marcus, because we're so far apart from the problem in space and time. And that's the problem with humans. Like we can't grasp problems that are really far away from us. And therefore, I think it's really important to act locally as well, and get people to understand that even though it's a global problem, it's something that you can actually handle locally as well. So at the same time as we need to pressure the governments and the international politicians, we also need to do something locally. And I personally have some really good experiences with doing like local involvement of people, both in their everyday lives, but also in their communities. So making people feel like they have a meaningful life, and that life only becomes meaningful if it's also sustainable. And especially in the future. That can be the smallest stuff. That can be giving people a reason to reduce their use of different things, or recycle things, or pressure their local governments to do better local transport, for instance, greener transport, stuff like that. And I think that's definitely something that we can all work on.
Yes. So now let's ask the audience again. Can you share your points and thoughts on the disconnect between the global public and the vanishing Arctic ice, when there are decades worth of scientific data and evidence to back it up? And what can we do to engage the global public more on the urgent matter to prioritize the Arctic? We can also say, how can we increase the value of the Arctic and drive solutions to protect it? Sorry, it goes a little fast, this one. Yes. How? Thoughts on the challenges we are faced with in bringing the Arctic to the forefront of the global climate change dialogue. Shall we try to make some new groups? And if you're watching online, you can talk to yourself. Maybe you're watching together with somebody, or you can write an email or comment in social media. Sier du fra? Ja, men jeg har ikke lyd på.
I don't know. Can Madrid hear Stockholm? Hi, Arne. This is Alexander here in Stockholm. If you can hear me, give me a thumbs up.
Yes, we can hear you.
That's beautiful. I can see you have a group there that's been discussing this, and we were wondering if you would like to share some thoughts on what you thought about the issue itself.
Yes. I think I could just go and get the mic, or Nadia will. So we have some really active ladies down there.
Perfect.
So which one? Just state your name and then give us some of your thoughts. Should we kind of link it to one of the questions, or do you want us to just take it over?
I was thinking to the last questions that you were discussing. If you can share some of the thoughts that you had on how do we bring the Arctic more into the forefront.
Yes, then we will do so.
Anyone?
Go ahead. Now they're arguing about who is going to... They have been going at it all the time, very active.
Perfect. Now we can see it as well. Perfect.
Hi, my name is Irene. I'm from Denmark. And I think that we have been, well, all through my childhood, we have heard about the rainforest, but we haven't heard so much about the Arctic region. And I think that's why the rainforest is much more at the forefront of the dialogue instead of the Arctic. When it comes to myself, I wasn't really interested in the Arctic until I visited Nuuk in Greenland a couple of years ago, and actually started talking to the people up there and understanding what does this frost you think. That was sort of like the feeling I had before I came there, and suddenly I started understanding what was actually the problem with the permafrost melting. It's not just the ice that's melting, it's actually people's houses and living conditions that's deteriorating, and that is a problem. And it affects the whole world. And we need to communicate this to everybody, and especially everybody who thinks that, well, if we don't have the big nations, then it's not worthwhile. But everybody can chip in and make a difference, I think.
Thank you very much. No, that's highly appreciated. Anyone from Stockholm who would like to share something they talked about? I'm not sure if you can see this, but you might be able to hear it at least.
Hello, my name is Inger. We talked a little bit about the fact that the Arctic might have a little bit of an image problem, and that when we think about the Arctic, we only think about the nature and the ice and the polar bear, and the fact that, well, I think we talked about that we need to bring forward the human side and the human stories that are in the Arctics, and in that way we can connect. We can get people to connect with the story and the problems in a more down-to-earth way.
Stockholm, I think we have another view here, if you let us.
Absolutely, go ahead. This is what this is all about.
My name is Lise Nielsen. I'm also from Denmark. I work with my colleague Irene at the Nordic Center for Renewable Energy. We discussed earlier how Amazonas is considered the lungs of the globe, of the world, and we discussed so what part is the Arctic region? If it's not the lungs, is it the heart? What is it? And we heard about the acidification of the oceans due to CO2 uptake in the Arctic oceans. We heard that the Arctic is a huge buffer for the globe in many different ways, and if the water melts, if the glaciers melt, we have even more problems. So this buffer is maybe the liver of the globe. And somebody took a little too long a sip of resources.
That's a good analogy. I think I'll bring it over to Heidi from here, and thank you for now, Madrid.
Thank you.
So, to our dear panelists again. For many around the world, the crisis is not about the future. The climate crisis is about right now. For people, not exactly in Stockholm maybe, and the youth as Greta Thunberg said a couple of days ago, they don't want to be praised, they want actions. So I would like to ask our panelists to take like 2 minutes each to share what kind of solutions, both natural, social, and technological, that exists and can be replicated and scaled to protect the Arctic. You've touched it like briefly, Amanda, too. So how can we stimulate user and citizen involvement in environmental and sustainable transition process?
Well, I think it's very important generally to make people actually to engage local people, so indigenous, for instance, in their solutions, because it's also their land. Even though these solutions, if we can talk about that at all, it's more are globally as well. I think it's, well, I think I would say I definitely don't believe in that we can wait for technology in this. Some people do. There's a lot of talk about geoengineering, for instance, ways of working with different technologies to actually lessen the light of the sun or the radiation of the sun coming into Earth, for instance, with mirrors in space. Or we also talk about making artificial clouds to cover for the sun. And I think all these different solutions are they're first of all very far away. It's not secure yet. We don't know the technologies. We don't know what they are going to do. We don't know what happens when we start to play with the climate system and the biology. So I think that's very dangerous to wait for. So I definitely believe in more human-centered solutions, where we start to believe in our own actions and actually do make a difference.
On a local level, you mean?
Well, yeah, I think it goes together. Yeah, so as we ask for global action, I think we need to handle it locally as well. So.
Marcus, how can people through organizations and institutions respond to pressing social and environmental challenges? And also when we discussed together, when the audience just talked, you want to talk about responses instead of solutions?
Yeah. First of all, it's a damn good question. How can people, through organizing, respond to these kinds of problems? And then could be seen a little bit as semantics, but I think when we talk about solutions, we create the sense that you can take action, put the problem away, and then you're done with it. And especially with climate change, that it's clear this is a moving target, and partly because we have put so much in the pipeline that this is going to continue certainly far beyond our lifetimes. So we should talk in terms of responses and how effective those are, and not in terms of something that's going to put the problem to rest and it'll disappear. And if we think about it in those terms, we're much more likely to stay agile and stay active on it and not think, okay, that's taken care of and now I can go home, or go take my vacation to Thailand, or those kinds of actions. So to understand that this is a problem that won't stop. It's like poverty. It's not something you solve and then you're finished with it. And then the other part, I think, what I really appreciate with this phenomenon with Greta Thunberg and with young people, having also been there at one point in time, is the idealism that drives engagement, and the sense that we have a stake in this, and we haven't been given a voice. We're gonna engage and make sure we get a voice, and you see that happening all over the place. And I think, some of the politics we see around us could be discouraging, but what I see in response to that, and it's not just young people, it's a whole range of different sort of groupings in society, is a level of mobilization I don't think that we've seen in a very long time, at least not in in the places that I've come from. And it's that mobilization in taking this seriously, in looking at how can we redesign how we live in a way that's more in something closer to being in harmony with the world we depend on, that will move us along in a direction that is more compatible with young people having a long, satisfying life and their children being able to follow.
Katarina, from the indigenous perspective, what type of mitigation and adaptation are the Sami faced with? For example, when it comes to reindeer herding for their livelihood.
Yes, so we are a very adaptive people. So the reindeers are, for example, during the winter, because of the climate change, you have the snow conditions changes more. It fluctuates more than it did before. And the reindeers, they eat food that are underneath the snow, so they have to dig through the snow to get to the food during winter. And when you have snow coming and then it's really warm, then it gets wet and it can also rain and then it gets cold, and you get this ice layer on top of the snow, and then the reindeer can't reach it. Or it's really wet during the autumn, and then it gets really cold, and then it comes snow, and then it gets warm, and then it's horrible. So then you have to adapt, because our goal is to make sure that the reindeer has it good. We want the reindeer to have food, but we also want the reindeer to live their natural way, which is wild, because the reindeer is semi-domesticated. The solution is not to put them into cages and have them like farm animals. That is not the solution. We want to have the reindeers to be able to strive wild, and that's why we also have need for grazing lands that are linked together, so that the reindeers can migrate through different areas to find food. Because also, if you eat in one place, you go and stamp on the snow, then it gets hard. Then you need a new place. But if you don't have this new place, then it's really hard. Then you don't have any food. So then you could just walk, and then you have a road there, and then it comes a car, and then it's good night for the reindeer. So it's a lot of adaptation to plan this. Where are we going to have the reindeers now? Where are we going to go? Which area can we use if it's not good there? What kind of weather is it going to be? How was the weather before? So it's not only a way of thinking of now, you have to think in a really holistic way to make sure that you have these land areas linked together, to make sure that you know, okay, but if it starts to rain, do we have a solution? So you always have different plans for it.
Thank you for sharing. Stian, there was an online question.
Yes, we have some viewers online, about 1,600, I think. So this is quite an arena for you guys. I think it's from Philadelphia in the US. So not good evening, good day to them. Yeah. Being so far from the Arctic in Philadelphia in the US, and never have been to the Arctic, what's the simplest message I can convey to people in my community? Do you have a simple answer to that?
Maybe Katarina.
The Arctic now.
I love the Arctic.
I think it's important to make sure that you know about Arctic, so that you can share your knowledge, so that we can get an understanding. And especially we need our politicians to have the understanding to understand the issue of the Arctic.
I think there's one issue that we haven't been talking about yet that is really important too, because as we're losing ice, we also get more free sort of land and also free passages around the Arctic. And that means that there's a lot of new attention to the Arctic now. So that is both with shipping, for instance, but also for digging for raw materials and resources. And I think if you need to tell somebody something about the Arctic, it is also that we need to pressure the politicians so they don't let these areas go to these kind of things. It's really important that we protect the areas and that it doesn't get used for all these raw material digging, for instance, because that's going to take a lot of the areas up as well, and that's not a way of protecting it. Yeah.
So after hearing this, and thank you, Philadelphia, for asking, the audience participants, both in Stockholm, Madrid, and online again, I know you saw this slide earlier, but again, how can we increase the value of the Arctic and drive solutions to protect it? Maybe you have some more to say on that question. Or shall we just move on? Okay. So, what inspired you the most from today's session on the Arctic? What are the takeaways that you can share with people in your community? This is for you, audiences. Like just a minute to discuss together, always together. Because we have to wrap up. But make sure you keep the dialogue going. Each one of us creates a ripple, and that's really important. And that means that it's important what every one of us does every day, every year. Just talking about it is important. So, and special thanks to our panelists today, and André, and all of you in Madrid, thank you.
Thank you.
To Memetur and our partners. So just a short video to inspire you on your way out today. So if you can take down the light, it's just a minute video. Maybe. Okay, thank you so much, and thank you, Amanda, Katarina, and Marcus. Where are you there? Thank you.